Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another sermon recap. Here we are on Tuesday, July 22nd, and we're going to be covering today what we went through on this previous Sunday, July 20th, where we were in Mark chapter 9, verses 30 through 41. The title of our sermon was Messianic Dissonance, and so we're going to jump right in and kind of go over the big discoveries and points from this past Sunday. I want to start with the first section we covered, which was verses 30, 31, and 32, which bear the same title as the sermon itself, this concept of Messianic dissonance. And so where I want to begin is with the first point I had on Sunday, which is the disciples' lack of understanding is tied to this misalignment between their expectations of Jesus and what Jesus had come to accomplish. And so we started by reintroducing the congregation to this psychological phenomenon known as cognitive dissonance. A very common definition of cognitive dissonance is as such: the mental discomfort experienced when holding conflicting beliefs, values, or attitudes, especially when one's actions contradict those beliefs. This conflict creates a state of unease, motivating individuals to reduce the dissonance through various strategies. So the dissonance is important here because otherwise we're not really capturing what the text says, because it tells us early in this section of Mark 9 that the disciples don't understand Jesus' sayings. And the tension in the text is, well, Jesus is speaking plainly to them. Like, he's not speaking via parable. This isn't hyperbolic. He's cutting straight to the quick. They should get this. And so unless the disciples were supremely stupid, then they comprehend the words he's saying. The issue is dissonance. They're not aligning with their expectations of him. And so the expectations are creating this dissonance between what Jesus is saying plainly and what they've come to expect him to say. And so as we jump in today, we have to look at the sources of that dissonance, and that's what we did on Sunday. We kind of briefly went back over and summarized once more the common messianic expectation of the day. All of the geopolitical and militaristic and nationalistic expectations of what was known in Israel as Messiah. But the other thing we need to recognize if we're going to speak about messianic dissonance is the very end of Jesus's promise, which he's now given them twice now. He gave it prior to the Mount of Transfiguration, and now he's given it afterwards. And it's this very simple: I'm going to be handed over to the hands of men. I'm going to be killed. And after I'm killed, he repeats it, then I will be raised again 3 days later. And it's the end that would have created even more dissonance, this introduction of this concept of resurrection that would have created dissonance. Because resurrection in the first century amongst a Jewish audience was not a topic that there was consensus on. In fact, it was a topic that was being spoken about a lot. So here are some of the preliminary thoughts around resurrection in the first century Jewish context. You had the Sadducees, one of the ruling parties of Israel, who flat out argued against the notion of resurrection. They argued there was no resurrection. And then you had Philo of Alexandria, the first century philosopher, Jewish philosopher, who was very Aristotelian. He taught a very Greek concept of resurrection in which our soul was immortal. So upon death, our immaterial soul would be liberated from our tainted carnal body, and we would sort of float up into our immortality. And you can see how that concept still persists in the church today. If you're not careful, you'll hear people talk about how they're going to live immaterially in heaven. It's like, no. That's not actually what Jesus promised. And then finally, and this is most interestingly, the Pharisees, the Pharisaic party of Israel, championed a bodily resurrection. They believed in and expected a bodily resurrection, but it was fused with the Messianic day. And so the idea is that it was the Messiah who they believed would hasten a mass resurrection of the righteous. And so they believed in resurrection, and they believed in resurrection tied to the Messiah. But the Messiah was the one who was going to be resurrecting people. It was the Messiah's job to resurrect and vindicate God's righteous who had died. And so for Jesus to tell them he was going to resurrect, it's entirely possible. They're like, wait a minute, but I thought you were going to be resurrecting people. And the irony here is that Jesus ultimately does resurrect people, but and will. But the idea here is that they've got their timeline mixed up, and so the dissonance is strong. They're failing to understand. And so what we should take away from all of this is sort of the practical application that we laid at the feet of the congregation on Sunday is this. Well, we don't align with Jesus as well as we think we do. I think that's what we need to recognize. And so we have this opportunity before us to humbly recognize that we need to appreciate Jesus's words and we need to humbly receive them. And if we feel that dissonance, we need to ask ourselves, is this dissonance because of my expectations, or is this dissonance for another matter altogether? And so Jesus gives us this beautiful moment here in Mark 9 where he says, I am speaking plainly to you, disciples, about what is to be expected, and it's incumbent upon them to receive that. The next section we covered in Mark chapter 9 was verses 33 through 37. I titled that section, The Paradox of Power. And again, it speaks to this dissonance, right? Because Jesus, when he's in the home in Capernaum with the disciples, asks them, hey, what were you guys talking about on the road when we were on our way here? And the disciples are once more really quiet and they don't have a lot to say. And the reason behind that is because while they were on the road, we're told they were arguing about who among them was the greatest, right? So that like right after Jesus has just gotten done telling them how he's going to willingly hand himself over to be killed, how he's going to be killed, and how he's going to rise again, showing how he's going to diminish himself. You have the disciples arguing about which among them's the greatest. Terrible irony here, right? And what we end up finding is Jesus is championing for them this understanding that true greatness, you can almost hear him arguing, guys, if you're going to argue about who's the greatest, at least have consensus on what greatness is. And greatness, according to Jesus, is diminishment. It's service. It's a posture of giving oneself to others. And perhaps the best quote on this comes from John Stott in his great work, The Cross of Christ, where he says the following. This is what greatness looks like. The essence of sin is man substituting himself for God, while the essence of salvation is God substituting himself for man. Man asserts himself against God and puts himself where only God deserves to be. God sacrifices himself for man and puts himself where only man deserves to be. Man claims prerogatives that belong to God alone. God accepts penalties that belong to man alone. And so Jesus, according to John Stott, is showing them greatness is inverted. You got it exactly backwards. All the things that lead to sin are what you think greatness are. And all the things that lead to true greatness are the things that will make you feel like you're doing it wrong, that there's no way greatness can come from this. And Jesus says that's actually how you bring it about. And then, of course, the best part of all about this lesson is that his proxy for this is a child. He takes a little boy and holds him in his arms and says, the kingdom of God is receiving one like this. And so you can see how even today that's easy for us to understand if you're a parent, right? Because a child is so needy and so dependent. And when you make less of yourself to serve your child, they can't materially give you anything for that. And so the only motivation that you can have for the way you serve your child is love. It's got to come from a place that transcends material transactions, right? This isn't propositional. This is true agape, true love that would allow a human to lower themselves to that extent in the service of another. And Jesus says a child is exactly the proxy you need to understand greatness. And then, of course, we ended in verses 40 and 41 with this charge, this exhortation to realize that Jesus is so black and white. You're either for him or you're against him. There is no neutrality with Jesus. In fact, our own actions betray the idea that we could be neutral towards Christ. Matthew 12, verse 30, whoever is not with me is against me, and whoever does not gather with me scatters. And so the idea is you are either with Christ and you are working with Christ, right? You're gathering with him. Your actions do not betray your allegiance to Christ, or you are not for Christ and all of your actions support your rebellion from him. And so the idea at the end of the sermon was, let's be for Christ, both in our posture and also in our deeds, also in our actions. Let's be people who champion Christ and then bear the fruit of one who champions Christ. And so that was our prayer for our congregation, and it's my prayer for you today. God bless you. We'll be back soon on Thursday to do a sermon preview. In the meantime, the sermon from this past Sunday is now online, and you can find it in the description of this video. Have a great day. We'll see you soon.